Good evening all and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we venture into the frozen heart of Alaska's most isolated communities, where entire towns operate under a veil of secrecy and the missing are never truly sought after. 10 documented accounts of disappearances, conspiracies, and phenomena that authorities refuse to investigate. These are not random incidents of wilderness survival gone wrong. These are the stories of people who entered small towns and discovered that their greatest threat was not the landscape, but the people who controlled it. From medical trafficking operations hidden beneath the earth to entire communities that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of normal time, we will explore accounts that challenge everything we understand about how communities operate in the far north. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Alaskan deep woods and remote settlements, where civilization ends and terror begins. The winter of 2008 came early to Lockhart, Alaska, a town so small that most people driving the park's highway between Anchorage and Wasilla would miss it entirely. 300 souls lived there, maybe less. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where a new face at the grocery store became the subject of conversation for weeks. Hunter had moved to Lockhart 5 years prior, running a small carpentry business that kept him busy enough. He was quiet, kept to himself, minded his own affairs. Nobody asked questions about the divorce or why he left Seattle. In a town like Lockhart, you learned not to pry too deeply into people's pasts. The property was impossible to miss. 5 acres of dense spruce forest on the western edge of town where the houses thinned out and the wilderness reasserted itself. A single dirt road led to the property line, and a weathered gate hung crooked on its hinges, though it was never locked. Hunter first noticed the place during winter, when the snow had buried most of the undergrowth, and the skeleton of the forest became visible. The main building was constructed of corrugated metal, the kind of structure that looked hastily assembled, utilitarian. No windows faced the road. The door was reinforced with chain and padlocks, multiple ones, suggesting not security but secrecy. Alexander Cost had purchased the property 3 years earlier. He was a tall man, skeletal thin, with skin that held a grayish pallor that suggested someone who avoided the sun. He kept irregular hours, often arriving and departing in the dead of night. His vehicle, a black Dodge pickup truck, bore out-of-state plates, though the registration was deliberately obscured with mud. Nobody in town knew much about him. He did not work at any of the local businesses. He did not attend community events. He purchased supplies from the hardware store, usually in bulk, and paid in cash. The store owner, Margaret, remembered him asking about industrial locks, reinforced hinges, and heavy-gauge wire mesh. Then there was the smell. Hunter first encountered it while cutting wood at a client's property adjacent to the Cost land. Winter wind carried it through the trees, something sweet and rotten, the kind of scent that made your throat close and your stomach turn. Dead animal, Hunter assumed, a moose that had wandered too far and succumbed to cold. It was not unusual. The forest took its dead and fed them back into the soil, but the smell persisted through January and into February. It grew worse, not better, which made Hunter's initial hypothesis seem wrong. Dead flesh should desiccate in the cold, should eventually freeze solid and emit nothing. This smell grew stronger. In mid-February, Hunter encountered Alexander at the hardware store. Cost was purchasing tarps, heavy-duty ones, the industrial-grade kind used for construction sites or heavy equipment storage. He also bought several 5-gallon drums, metal, with tight-fitting lids. Margaret rang him up without comment, but afterward she mentioned the purchase to Hunter, catching his eye with a particular kind of look that suggested concern. She did not say why she was troubled by it. She did not need to. The smell reached a crescendo in early March, when the air began to warm slightly and the forest started its slow thaw. Hunter was working at a nearby property when he saw the plume of black smoke rising from the coastland, thick and oily, the kind of smoke that came from burning rubber or plastic, substances that should not have been burned in an open fire. The smoke lasted for hours. When it finally ceased, the smell had changed. It was still foul, still nauseating, but different somehow. Less organic, less like rotting meat, and more like ash and chemical residue. Hunter mentioned it to no one. Not yet. He had learned long ago that suspicion, without evidence, only created enemies. But 3 days later, a young woman named Sarah came to his workshop. She was perhaps 20 years old, thin, with bruises on her arms that looked like finger marks. She asked if Hunter had any work available, any jobs that might pay cash. Her eyes were wrong. They had the particular flatness of someone who had been broken and then hastily repaired. Hunter, who had learned to read people in his time away from Seattle, understood that she was running from something. He told her he could hire her to help with inventory and basic repairs, minimum wage, paid weekly. Sarah accepted immediately, with the kind of relief that suggested she had expected him to refuse. Over the course of 3 weeks, Sarah's story came out in fragments. She had arrived in Lockhart seeking seasonal work. She had accepted a ride from someone she met at a diner in Wasilla. The ride had been supposed to end at a bed and breakfast on the southern edge of Lockhart. Instead, the driver had taken her directly to the Cost property. There, she had been held for 2 days in a concrete room beneath the main structure, a room she had not known existed. The details of what happened in that room Sarah would not speak about. Her hands shook when she tried, but she had managed to find a window, a small one, at ground level. She had waited until darkness fell, had broken the glass quietly, had squeezed through the opening despite the cuts, and had run. Alexander Cost was not at the property when Sarah fled. She had heard his vehicle leave hours earlier. By the time she had made her way into town, to the diner where she could use a phone, Coast was gone. His truck was gone. The property gate hung open, and when authorities arrived to investigate Sarah's claims, they found the main structure empty. The metal building had been thoroughly cleaned. The interior walls showed no signs of anyone having been detained there. No evidence of a basement, no concrete room, no window with broken glass. The officers, including Sheriff Dalton, had seemed skeptical. Sarah's story sounded like a fabrication, they suggested. Perhaps she had never been at the property at all. Perhaps she was trying to manufacture attention or cause trouble for a neighbor who had simply refused to hire her. Sarah left town 2 weeks later. Hunter drove her to the bus station in Anchorage. She did not look back, but Hunter could not stop looking back. He began researching Alexander Cost, or rather he began attempting to. Online databases yielded little. The name appeared on property records, but the history before that was blank. No previous residences, no criminal record, no driver's license history before his Alaskan plates. It was as if Alexander Cost had materialized into existence the moment he purchased the property in Lockhart. He then began investigating the property itself, carefully during daylight hours, always careful to ensure he was not being watched. The metal building remained locked, but Hunter discovered that the chain and padlocks were recent additions. On the building's western side, where the wood began to rot and separate from the corrugated metal, he found something that made his pulse quicken. Deep gouges in the interior wall, parallel scratches as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly across the floor, and in one corner, nearly invisible against the rust staining, what appeared to be dried blood smeared across a metal seam. He called the police. He made a formal report describing what he had observed. Sheriff Dalton came to the property personally, examined the building, and told Hunter that the marks were consistent with wildlife activity, possibly bears preparing a den. The staining was likely rust discoloration, not blood. There was nothing actionable, nothing criminal. Hunter's report would remain on file, but without probable cause to search the building, nothing more could be done. 3 weeks later, Hunter received a visitor at his workshop, a woman, thin and pale with dark circles under her eyes. She introduced herself as Patricia and said she was Alexander Cost's sister. She explained that she had heard rumors in town about her brother. She wanted to warn Hunter to stop investigating him. Cost, she said, was not a person to antagonize. He had moved to Alaska precisely because it was remote, precisely because law enforcement was thin and scattered, precisely because a person could disappear into the wilderness and never be found. Patricia did not make threats explicitly. She did not need to. The message was clear. Hunter stopped his informal investigation after that, but the fear did not stop. He began changing his daily routine, taking different routes to his work sites, varying the times he left his home. He purchased a security system, cameras that he installed without the knowledge of any locksmith or contractor. He kept a handgun in his truck, though he had never been a gun owner before. He found himself watching the road to Coast's property, noting the tire tracks, the occasional sign that someone had been moving through the forest. In April, a vehicle matching Cost's truck was spotted in British Columbia, 4 hours north. RCMP had pulled him over for a traffic violation, had checked his identification, and had found nothing irregular. Cost had been released. He had headed back south, toward Alaska, toward Lockhart. Hunter never saw Alexander Cost again. The property changed hands the following summer, sold through a real estate company in Anchorage to a family from the lower 48 who wanted a retreat property. The metal building was demolished. The concrete structure beneath, if it had ever existed, was never excavated. The family eventually sold the property again, never having spent more than 2 weeks there. 5 years later, nearly a decade after Sarah's escape, a young woman's remains were discovered in a ravine outside Fairbanks, 4 hours north of Lockhart. She had been missing for 8 years. Her identification, when confirmed through dental records, revealed her name to be Jennifer Marks. She had been reported missing from Wasilla approximately 2 weeks after Sarah had fled the Cost property. The medical examiner found evidence of trauma, evidence suggesting captivity, evidence suggesting things that should not be spoken about in polite company. Alexander Cost was never charged. He was never formally questioned. By the time Jennifer Marks was identified, Cost had disappeared entirely. No one knew if he had died, if he had relocated, if he was living under a different name in some other remote corner of the country. The authorities suggested that he might be responsible for additional disappearances spanning years across multiple states. They suggested this quietly in official reports that very few people ever saw. Hunter still lives in Lockhart. He still runs his carpentry business. He still drives past the property occasionally, though it looks different now, residential and ordinary, someone's family home. But he no longer drives alone into remote areas. He no longer accepts contracts from new clients without extensive verification. And every time a missing persons report crosses the local news, he finds himself wondering if Cost is still out there, if he ever truly left. If the forest that he loved so much might still be hiding its secrets in places that human eyes would never think to look. The forest keeps what it wishes to keep, and some stones, once they are turned over, should be left undisturbed. The drive from Anchorage to Fairbanks takes approximately 8 hours along the park's highway, a stretch of asphalt that cuts through the Alaskan interior like a scar through untouched wilderness. Most travelers complete it in one day, stopping perhaps once or twice for fuel or food at the sparse communities that dot the highway at irregular intervals. Brooklyn had driven it dozens of times before, always during daylight, always with a full tank and a thermos of hot coffee. She was returning from a job interview in Anchorage, one that had not gone particularly well, though the interview itself had been less important than the trip itself. She needed to get back to Fairbanks. She had told her mother she would call when she arrived. That was the agreement. It was late October, and the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon earlier each day, a reminder that winter was approaching with the inevitability of a predator that never stops hunting. Brooklyn had left Anchorage at 2 in the afternoon, later than she had intended. The interview had run long, and she had spent an additional hour exploring a bookstore downtown, procrastinating the drive. By the time she merged onto the park's highway, the sun was already touching the peaks of the Talkeetna Mountains to the west, painting them orange and purple. The highway was relatively empty. That was not unusual for a Tuesday afternoon in late October. Most commercial traffic ran overnight. Private vehicles were scattered, never more than one or two visible at any given time through the long stretches between communities. Brooklyn settled into a rhythm, maintaining a steady 70 miles per hour, watching the landscape unfold through her windshield. Stands of birch and aspen mixed with darker spruce forests, occasional mountains in the distance. The road curved and straightened, a monotonous, hypnotic pattern. Near mile marker 237, approximately an hour and a half north of Anchorage, she noticed the man standing on the shoulder of the highway. He was thin, with dark hair and a gaunt face that suggested he had not eaten well in some time. His clothing was inappropriate for the season. A light jacket over jeans, no gloves, no hat despite temperatures that were already dropping toward freezing as the sun descended. He was holding his thumb out in the traditional hitchhiking posture, though his expression held something strange. Not desperate, not grateful, something that did not quite read as human emotion at all. Just a blank expectation, as if he knew someone would stop and was merely waiting for the inevitable. Brooklyn had picked up hitchhikers before. She had been raised to be cautious, but also to believe in the basic goodness of people, a belief that her mother had instilled in her despite growing up in Alaska, where the landscape was vast enough to hide almost anything. She pulled to the shoulder and came to a stop approximately 20 feet ahead of him. She waited, engine running, and watched in her rearview mirror as he approached the passenger side door. He smiled when she asked where he was heading. His teeth were stained yellow and brown, and his smile did not reach his eyes. "Fairbanks," he said. "Family emergency." Car had broken down about 40 miles back. He had been walking for a while. He was grateful for the ride. Brooklyn noted that his hands were shaking slightly, either from cold or from something else. She told him to get in. His name was Griffin, or so he claimed. He did not offer a last name, and Brooklyn did not press. He settled into the passenger seat with a kind of strange satisfaction, as if he had accomplished something significant. The scent that came off him was acrid, a combination of sweat and something chemical, something that made the back of Brooklyn's throat tighten. She turned the heat up slightly and cracked the window, telling him she needed fresh air. Griffin did not protest. He sat quietly for several miles, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and somewhat slurred, as if he was speaking underwater. He asked Brooklyn where she was from. She told him Fairbanks, though she was vague about the exact location. He nodded, as if this was exactly what he had expected her to say. He told her that Fairbanks was a good town, the kind of town where people minded their own business, the kind of town where you could do things and nobody would ask questions because they were too busy surviving the cold. Brooklyn felt something shift in her gut, an alarm, primitive and ancient, triggered by something in his tone that suggested danger. She told him she needed to maintain focus on the road, hoping silence would discourage further conversation. Griffin complied, lapsing back into that strange quietness. But Brooklyn noticed that he was watching her now, not continuously, but often, glancing at her profile as she drove, then looking away when she turned her head, studying her hands on the steering wheel, taking inventory of her like something was cataloging information. The sun was now fully below the horizon, and darkness had settled across the landscape with the finality of a closing door. The highway stretched ahead and behind, visible only in the envelope of her headlights. The communities between Anchorage and Fairbanks were sparse, and the distances between them were measured in tens of miles. The nearest gas station was still perhaps 30 miles ahead. Brooklyn gripped the steering wheel more tightly and told herself that she was overreacting, that Griffin was simply a man in unfortunate circumstances, that her fear was unfounded. Then Griffin reached down and touched the door handle, not to open it, but to run his fingers along the lock mechanism, testing it, as if he was determining whether it was engaged. Brooklyn's pulse jumped. She asked him what he was doing. He turned to look at her, and in that moment, in the darkness of the vehicle with only the dashboard lights illuminating his face, something shifted behind his eyes. He smiled again, that same smile that did not reach his eyes, and told her that he was checking to make sure the door was working properly. He had a habit of getting car sick if the doors did not feel secure. Brooklyn did not believe him. She did not believe anything about him. She kept one hand on the steering wheel and moved her other hand to the gear shift, reducing her speed. She told him that if he felt sick, she could pull over. Griffin shook his head. He said he would be fine. He just needed her to drive faster. They were not making very good time. He had family waiting, and they were very concerned about him. He said this without inflection, without any emotion at all, and Brooklyn understood in that moment that she had made a terrible mistake. She was approaching a stretch of highway where the terrain flattened and widened, a section where pull-offs were common. Road conditions ahead showed clear, with no settlements indicated for the next 50 miles. Her cell phone, she realized, had no signal. She had not checked it since entering the vehicle with Griffin. She had no way to call for help. And beside her sat a man who was watching her with the patience of a predator, waiting for her to make a decision that would place her in a position of vulnerability. Brooklyn made a choice. She accelerated suddenly, pushing the vehicle to 80 miles per hour, then 90. She told Griffin that she needed to get him to Fairbanks quickly, that she understood his urgency. Griffin's hands gripped the dashboard, and his jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The highway curved ahead, and Brooklyn took the turn hard, feeling the vehicle's suspension compress and then release. She watched Griffin's body shift with the momentum. At the next pull-off, approximately 5 miles further along, Brooklyn spotted a vehicle parked on the shoulder. A truck with lights visible inside. A rest area. Civilization. Brooklyn made the decision in an instant. She swerved hard toward the pull-off, gravel spraying, and came to an abrupt stop near the truck. She shouted that Griffin needed to get out, that he could wait for another ride here, that she was not going any further. Griffin moved with unexpected speed. He lunged across the center console toward her, and Brooklyn threw herself against the driver's side door, which was already unlocked. She tumbled out onto the gravel, scrambling to her feet. Griffin emerged from the passenger side, and for a moment they stood facing each other across the hood of her vehicle in the darkness. The other vehicle, she noticed now, had no one inside. It was empty. Just a decoy, perhaps, or simply a vehicle abandoned for other reasons. Brooklyn ran. She ran toward the forest, away from the highway, away from Griffin. She did not look back. She heard him calling, after her, his voice taking on an almost sing-song quality, telling her that it was okay, that he just wanted to talk, that she did not need to be afraid. The trees became denser, and Brooklyn pushed through them, branches whipping at her face, drawing blood. She ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When she finally stopped, when her lungs were burning and her legs would no longer support her, she huddled behind a massive fallen log and waited. The forest was silent. Completely silent. No sound of pursuit. No snapping branches. No voice calling out. After perhaps 30 minutes of absolute stillness, Brooklyn made her way back toward the highway, moving slowly, carefully, testing each step before putting her full weight down. When she emerged from the forest, her vehicle was still there, the passenger door standing open. Griffin was gone. She drove the remaining distance to Fairbanks at speeds that would have cost her a significant speeding ticket if any police had been present. She did not stop for fuel or food, though her vehicle was running low on both. When she reached Fairbanks and saw the lights of the city, she pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour coffee shop and sat in the idling vehicle with her hands shaking too badly to turn off the ignition. She reported the incident to the police, describing Griffin in detail. She provided the license plate number of the abandoned truck. which belonged to a vehicle reported missing 3 weeks earlier from Anchorage. She described the scent that had clung to him, the way his eyes did not move correctly, the comment about Fairbanks being a place where people minded their own business. The officer who took her report listened patiently and then explained that hitchhiker incidents were relatively common, that many men fitting Griffin's description existed throughout Alaska, that without a specific crime having been committed, there was little they could do. They did circulate her description through state police channels. A partial match came back for a man who had been questioned in connection with 3 missing persons cases spanning 5 years across Alaska and British Columbia. No charges had ever been filed. All 3 missing persons had been women traveling alone. No bodies had ever been recovered. No definitive link had ever been established. Brooklyn did not drive the Parks Highway again. She transferred her job search focus to positions within Fairbanks. She eventually moved to Seattle, leaving Alaska entirely, unable to shake the feeling that Griffin was still out there, still watching the highways, still waiting at mile markers for women who made the mistake of stopping. The abandoned truck was never reclaimed. No one came forward to claim ownership. It remained in an impound lot in Fairbanks for 3 months before being sold at auction. The buyer drove it for approximately a month before reporting that he felt watched whenever he drove it at night, that he heard sounds in the back seat when no one was there, that he eventually sold it to a used car lot without ever discovering who had abandoned it on the shoulder of the Parks Highway. Some roads, once they have claimed something, do not return it easily. Jonathan had always been the type of person who accepted work without asking too many questions. He was a contractor, skilled with his hands, capable of demolition and construction in equal measure. At 42 years old, divorced twice over, living in a small apartment in Palmer with minimal possessions, he existed in that liminal space between living and merely surviving. So when he received the call from Diaz, a man he had worked with sporadically over the previous decade, he did not hesitate. Diaz explained the job simply. There was an abandoned settlement in the remote interior, approximately 90 miles northeast of Talkeetna. The location was not precisely marked on modern maps, but Diaz had a detailed set of GPS coordinates and directions. The property owner, a corporation with unclear purpose and equally unclear headquarters, was interested in clearing the main structures from the site. Not demolishing them necessarily, but removing them, loading them onto trucks and transporting them elsewhere. It was unusual work, Diaz admitted, but the pay was exceptional, $5,000 each for approximately 2 weeks of labor. Jonathan would need to bring his own tools and equipment. He would need to be self-sufficient, as the nearest settlement was nearly 40 miles away. And most importantly, he would need to be discreet. The property was private, legally protected, and the corporation did not appreciate unwanted attention or documentation. Jonathan accepted immediately. $5,000 would solve his immediate financial problems. 2 weeks of isolation in the Alaskan wilderness seemed preferable to another month of struggling to find work in Palmer. He made arrangements to close his apartment for the duration, purchase supplies for the trip, and met Diaz at a rendezvous point approximately 30 miles northeast of Talkeetna, where a rough logging road branched off the main highway. The settlement came into view after nearly 2 hours of increasingly difficult driving. The road deteriorated from gravel to hardpan to barely distinguishable tracks through the forest. Jonathan counted the structures as they approached. 7 buildings remained standing, though several were tilting at concerning angles, their wood bleached and weathered to a nearly white color. The main structure was larger than the others, a multi-purpose building that might have housed administrative offices or communal living space. 2 smaller cabins flanked it. 3 more structures, their purposes obscured by age and decay, stood at a distance. Diaz explained the plan. They would begin with the smaller structures, disassembling them carefully, removing the materials to be loaded onto the trucks that would arrive on day 5. The main building would be left for last. It was structurally compromised, Diaz noted, and would likely collapse if subjected to too much stress. They would need to work slowly, carefully, consulting reference materials if necessary. Jonathan found the work straightforward but eerie. The buildings, though clearly abandoned for decades, held the strange quality of having been departed from rapidly. In the largest cabin, he found plates still sitting on a table, their surfaces covered in dust so thick it looked like gray snow. A coffee pot, its metal oxidized and crumbling, sat on what had once been a cooking stove. Beds in the bunkhouse were still made, military corners on the sheets despite the fabric having mostly rotted away. It was as if the occupants had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only the shells of their living spaces. By the third day, Jonathan had begun to notice something odd about the structure's construction. The main building had an unusual basement, concrete poured perhaps half a meter into the earth, extending further back than the visible portion of the building suggested possible. He mentioned this to Diaz, who became uncharacteristically quiet. Diaz replied that the basement was not Jonathan's concern. It was not to be disturbed. The job involved the surface structures only. They would not be excavating or entering any subsurface areas. But Jonathan could not help himself. Curiosity, that ancient human weakness, drove him to investigate. When Diaz went into town on day 4 to meet the trucks and finalize logistics, Jonathan made his way to the basement entrance. It was sealed with plywood, nailed shut from the outside, suggesting that whatever lay below had been deliberately locked away. Using his crowbar, Jonathan pried away the plywood covering. The odor that emerged was immediate and overwhelming, a chemical scent so pungent it made his eyes water and his throat close. He did not investigate further. He replaced the plywood immediately and returned to his work. When Diaz returned that evening, he knew. He could see it in Jonathan's face, in the subtle discomfort that Jonathan could not quite hide. Diaz did not confront him directly. Instead, he simply stated, with absolute clarity, that Jonathan had not seen anything. That whatever might exist below the structure was not relevant to the task at hand. That questions would not be appreciated, and that such questions might result in Jonathan not receiving his payment. More than that, questions might result in Jonathan developing a serious health condition that would prevent him from ever working again. The threat was delivered calmly, without inflection, which somehow made it more terrifying than if Diaz had raged. Jonathan understood that he had crossed an invisible boundary and that the crossing had consequences. He agreed to forget what he had encountered. He would not mention the basement. He would not ask questions. He would complete the job and leave, and the $5,000 would appear in his bank account within 1 week. The trucks arrived on day 5, massive flatbeds capable of carrying substantial weight. The drivers did not introduce themselves. They worked in efficient silence, loading the materials that Jonathan and Diaz had prepared. The smaller cabins were fully disassembled and loaded by day 6. By day 7, only the main building remained. Diaz explained that they would not, after all, be removing the main structure. The corporation had decided that it would remain in place. Jonathan and Diaz were to spend their remaining time ensuring that the basement was sealed even more thoroughly, ensuring that no one could accidentally breach it. They reinforced the plywood, added additional nailing, poured concrete over the entrance, and then covered that concrete with soil and debris. By the time they finished, there was no visible indication that a basement entrance had ever existed. The building appeared to be simply another abandoned structure, its secrets safely buried. On day 14, Jonathan and Diaz packed their equipment and departed the settlement. Diaz drove separately, and they did not speak during the drive back to the rendezvous point. When they reached the highway, Diaz handed Jonathan an envelope containing $5,000 in cash. He told Jonathan that it had been a pleasure working with him, but that their professional relationship had concluded. They would not work together again. If Jonathan spoke to anyone about what he had witnessed at the settlement, serious consequences would follow. Diaz hoped that Jonathan would choose to remain silent, for his own sake. Jonathan kept the money and the silence. He returned to Palmer, tried to resume his life, and attempted to forget the settlement, but he found that he could not. The image of those abandoned structures, the knowledge of what lay sealed beneath the main building, the strange efficiency with which the operation had been conducted, it consumed him. He began researching. He looked for property records, corporate filings, anything that might explain what he had witnessed. He discovered that the land had been owned by a series of shell corporations, each one purchasing from another, each one barely existing in any verifiable sense. The trail led nowhere. He discovered references in local archives to a small mining operation that had existed in that location during the 1970s and 1980s. The operation had been abandoned suddenly, the workers evacuated, the site left untouched for decades. No mining company had ever publicly acknowledged the operation. No records existed of what had been extracted or why the work had ceased. Jonathan contacted Diaz 3 weeks after completing the job, asking for more information, for some kind of explanation. Diaz did not respond. Jonathan's calls went to a disconnected number. Emails went unanswered. When Jonathan attempted to contact Diaz through other means, using mutual acquaintances and professional networks, he learned that Diaz had relocated. No one knew where. Several people mentioned that Diaz had seemed anxious before disappearing, looking over his shoulder, speaking in whispers about loose ends and retirement. Jonathan reported everything to the Alaska State Police. He provided coordinates, descriptions, and his own account of the work. The police responded with apparent interest initially, then with increasing indifference. An officer eventually called him back to report that the land, when examined by satellite, showed no structures visible from above. Either the buildings had been removed entirely, or they had never existed at all. Regarding the basement, there was nothing that suggested criminal activity. Sealed storage areas were not inherently illegal. Without evidence of a specific crime, there was nothing the police could investigate. Jonathan still lives in Palmer, though he moved to a different apartment. He still works in construction, though he has relocated to Anchorage to avoid potential encounters with Diaz or anyone connected to the settlement. He does not sleep well. He has recurring nightmares about what might have been stored in that basement, about what the smell suggested, about the implication that people might have been involved in processes that required that level of secrecy. Years later, he read about a series of illegal pharmaceutical experiments that had been conducted in remote locations throughout Alaska during the 1970s and 1980s. The experiments involved homeless individuals and indigenous populations, people whose disappearance would not trigger immediate investigation. The experiments had continued for over a decade before being discovered by accident. Several researchers had been prosecuted, though sentences were light and the full scope of the operation was never determined. Jonathan wondered if the settlement he had helped to clean had been one such location. He wondered if the chemical smell that emerged from the basement was consistent with pharmaceutical waste disposal. He wondered if the bodies of test subjects might still be buried beneath the concrete he had helped to pour. But he never voiced these suspicions aloud. He did not contact authorities again. He did not attempt to return to the settlement location, because some knowledge, once acquired, becomes a burden that one carries silently, never sharing it, never confirming it, living with the understanding that certain mysteries might be safer left unsolved. The forest keeps what it wishes to keep, and sometimes the things we witness are better left forgotten. Skylar had lived in Wasilla her entire life. She was born there in 1974, raised in that town as it grew from a small community into a suburban sprawl feeding off the proximity to Anchorage. She had roots there, the kind of roots that kept a person anchored, even when the currents of life pulled in other directions. She was a researcher by training, a librarian, and archivist by profession, working at the Wasilla City Archives, a position that paid modestly but offered access to historical records that fascinated her. Skylar possessed the kind of mind that found patterns in data, that could examine seemingly unrelated incidents and detect threads connecting them. Hayes had been the Matanuska-Susitna Borough police chief for 12 years. He was a bulky man in his late 50s, with a weathered face and eyes that held something secretive, something guarded. He had grown up in the same community as Skylar, though they had not been close during childhood. They inhabited different social strata, existed in different circles, but Wasilla was small enough that everyone eventually crossed paths with everyone else. Skylar first encountered Hayes professionally when she began researching missing persons cases spanning a 30-year period in the Wasilla area. She was compiling data for a community awareness project. She explained to the officer who directed her to the police records. She wanted to create a timeline of incidents to help educate the community about patterns and risks. The officer seemed somewhat bemused by her project, but cooperated, pulling files and making copies. What Skylar discovered in those files was troubling. Between 1985 and 2015, 43 people had gone missing from the Wasilla area. Some had been found. Some had been located in other communities. Some had simply ceased to exist, their names becoming footnotes in old reports that few people read. But what struck Skylar most forcefully was that the disappearances seemed to cluster, not randomly scattered across the years, but concentrated in particular seasons, particular years, and they seemed to follow a pattern that no one had apparently noticed, or if they had noticed, no one had documented. Skylar created a visual map, marking each disappearance with a colored pin on a physical map of the Wasilla area. Green pins for cases where the person was located. Red pins for unsolved disappearances. When the map was complete, she stood back and examined it. The red pins formed a cluster in the northern section of the city, in areas that bordered the Matanuska Valley. They seemed to concentrate around a 3-mile radius, with sporadic outliers beyond that perimeter. Most significantly, the clusters seemed to be growing. Cases that had been isolated incidents in the 1990s and early 2000s were becoming more frequent by 2010. By 2015, 3 people had gone missing within a 9-month period, all from within the cluster area. Skylar brought her findings to the police department. She requested a meeting with Chief Hayes, believing that he should see what she had discovered. Hayes agreed to see her, though he seemed reluctant, as if he had already anticipated what she would present to him. When she laid out her map and explained her findings, Hayes examined it without comment. His expression remained neutral, though his jaw tightened slightly. When she finished her presentation, Hayes was quiet for a long moment before responding. He told Skylar that he appreciated her work, but that the police department could not prioritize investigations based on clustering patterns alone. Each case had been investigated individually. Some remained open. Some had legitimate explanations. There was no evidence of a connection between the disappearances. To suggest otherwise, he cautioned, might create unnecessary panic in the community. Skylar pushed back. She asked Hayes about specific cases, about Maria Gutierrez, missing since 2008, about Robert Chen, missing since 2010, about Jennifer Woodsworth, missing since 2014. She had read their files. She had noted that none of them fit the typical missing person profile. They were not suicidal. They did not have histories of substance abuse or erratic behavior. They had simply vanished from their homes or from the streets in their neighborhood. And their cases, after the initial investigation period, had gone completely cold. Hayes stood and told Skylar that he understood her passion for the research, but that she was operating in areas beyond her expertise. Police work was complex. Coincidences existed. Not every pattern represented an actual connection. He suggested with apparent sincerity that Skylar might want to redirect her research toward historical topics rather than contemporary cases. The living had an inconvenient habit of involving themselves in legal matters, including defamation suits. Skylar left the meeting deeply unsettled. She did not, however, abandon her research. Instead, she became more careful, more methodical. She began cross-referencing the missing persons cases with other data sets. She examined hospital records, emergency room visits, even property records and vehicle registrations. What she was searching for, she could not articulate precisely, but she trusted that if a pattern existed, the data would reveal it. 6 months later, she made a discovery that would transform her understanding of the situation. She found a connection between 6 of the missing persons cases. Not a direct connection, but a peripheral one. All 6 of the individuals had reported in police statements or medical records encounters with an individual they could not fully identify. Sometimes the description was vague: a man, medium build, unknown age. Sometimes it was more specific: a man with unusual eyes, or a man who seemed to know things he should not have known. One victim, Maria Gutierrez, had provided a statement to police 2 weeks before. She disappeared, saying that a man had approached her at a shopping center and told her specific personal information that she had never shared publicly. She had been frightened by the encounter and reported it to police. 2 weeks later, she was gone. Schuyler compiled this secondary research and approached Hayes again. She told him about the connections, about the repeated encounters with an unidentified individual. She suggested that these incidents might be relevant to the missing persons investigations. Hayes listened patiently, then stood and informed Schuyler that she was beginning to concern him. She was, he said, engaged in the kind of speculation that could damage reputation, could create liability for the police department, and could potentially obstruct official investigations. He was advising her, both as a professional colleague and as someone who had known her for many years, to cease her research immediately. Schuyler asked him if he knew something about the cases that he was not sharing. Hayes met her eyes, and for a moment something broke through his professional demeanor. Something that might have been fear, or might have been resignation. He told her quietly that some cases remained unsolved for reasons that had nothing to do with police competence or negligence. Some cases, he said, involved matters that were beyond police jurisdiction, and that engaging with such matters could be dangerous. He was warning her, both as someone who had known her for years and as someone who did not wish to see her hurt. Schuyler left the police station with a sense of profound unease. Hayes had essentially confirmed that he knew something, that there was something he was not investigating or investigating only minimally, and that he was actively discouraging her from pursuing the matter further. Over the following months, Schuyler became increasingly aware that she was being watched. Not constantly, but sporadically. She would notice the same vehicles appearing in different contexts. She would see the same faces at the library archives requesting nothing, simply sitting and observing. People who had been friendly toward her became distant or hostile. Her research materials at the library began to disappear. Files that she had compiled, maps that she had created, all seemed to vanish when she was not actively monitoring them. One evening, Schuyler was leaving the library. She was approached by a man whose appearance matched some of the descriptions she had read in Maria Gutierrez's police statement. He did not threaten her. He did not raise his voice. He simply told her that she was researching matters that were not her concern, that she should stop her investigation, that continuing would result in consequences. He told her that the people she was trying to help were already beyond helping, and that drawing attention to them would only create problems for the living. Schuyler moved to Anchorage the following week. She discontinued her research. She attempted to return to her normal life, working in another library, maintaining her distance from Wasilla and from the mysteries she had unearthed there. But she kept copies of her research secured in a safety deposit box, and she continued to monitor news reports from the Wasilla area. In 2018, Chief Hayes died suddenly of a heart attack at age 64. Schuyler saw his obituary and felt a strange mixture of sadness and suspicion. In 2019, a young woman named Patricia came forward claiming to have escaped from an unlicensed facility operating in the wooded areas north of Wasilla. She described a place where people were held, where medical procedures were performed without consent, where individuals seemed to exist in a chemically induced state of compliance. She provided sketches and descriptions that matched some of the disappearances that Schuyler had documented. The police investigated. No facility was found. No evidence was discovered that supported Patricia's claims. Within 6 months, Patricia had disappeared again. No investigation was opened. She was considered a voluntary missing person, someone who had likely returned to whatever circumstances had existed before her brief claim of escape. Schuyler never returned to Wasilla. She never resumed her research into the missing persons cases. She lives now in Anchorage, maintaining her distance from her birthplace, but she still has the maps, still has the files, still has the documentation of the pattern she discovered. She knows something occurred in Wasilla during those 30 years. She knows that Hayes knew and did not investigate. She knows that people are still missing, that the pattern may be continuing, and that someone does not wish for that pattern to be examined too closely. Some cold cases, she has learned, remain cold not because they cannot be solved, but because powerful forces exist that prefer them to remain unsolved. And sometimes, investigating those cases comes with a personal cost that exceeds the value of whatever truth might be discovered. The file remains in her safety deposit box, gathering dust, a secret that Schuyler carries alone, knowing that sharing it would accomplish nothing except her own disappearance. Aaron had always preferred solitude. It was not a learned preference, but something innate, something that had emerged during childhood and persisted through adulthood. He had tried conventional life, he had attempted relationships, had worked various jobs, had followed the trajectory that society deemed appropriate. But each attempt had ended in failure and frustration. At 39 years old, divorced from a woman who had eventually grown weary of his emotional distance, he had decided that solitude was not a personality flaw to be corrected, but rather a fundamental truth about himself to be embraced. The cabin was advertised in a classified listing online as a rental available for short or long-term occupation. It was located in the remote interior of Alaska, approximately 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a rough logging road that became nearly impassable during winter. The rental price was reasonable, suggesting that the owner cared less about profit than about simply maintaining the property. Aaron paid a deposit and arranged to collect the keys from the owner, Jenkins, during a brief window in late August when Aaron could make the drive north from his home in Juneau. Jenkins was a man perhaps 10 years Aaron's senior, with weathered skin and hands that bore the calluses of someone who spent significant time working with his hands. He lived in a small house on the edge of the town, surrounded by various projects in various states of completion. A truck sat on blocks. A cabin frame rose from a concrete foundation. Stacks of lumber occupied the yard. Jenkins explained that the rental cabin had belonged to his brother, but that his brother had relocated to Oregon and no longer had use of the property. Jenkins had inherited responsibility for its maintenance. Jenkins insisted on driving Aaron to the cabin personally, explaining that the access road was treacherous and that without guidance, Aaron might miss the turnoff or become lost. Aaron appreciated the assistance and climbed into Jenkins' truck, a weathered Dodge that had clearly seen decades of rough use. The drive took nearly 2 hours, during which Jenkins spoke intermittently about the history of the area, about the old logging operations that had ceased years ago, about the wilderness itself, and how one adapted to living in such profound isolation. The cabin was simple, but well maintained. A single large room served as living space, with a wood stove for heating and a basic kitchen setup. A bedroom and bathroom occupied the rear. Windows faced the forest on all sides, providing views of spruce and birch trees that stretched toward the horizon. Jenkins walked Aaron through the cabin systems, explaining how to operate the generator for power, how to maintain the water supply, how to manage the heating. He provided Aaron with his phone number and instructed him to call if anything malfunctioned or if Aaron had questions. Before leaving, Jenkins paused at the doorway. He asked Aaron if he planned to venture into the forest, if he expected to hike or explore. Aaron replied that he would likely do some exploration, yes. Jenkins nodded and told Aaron that he should be careful. The forest had dangers that were not always obvious. He mentioned bears, which was unsurprising. He mentioned getting lost, which was predictable for someone unfamiliar with the terrain. But he also made an oblique reference to local residents who lived deeper in the wilderness, people or creatures that kept to themselves, but who should not be approached under any circumstances. When Aaron asked Jenkins to clarify, Jenkins seemed reluctant, but eventually explained that indigenous peoples maintained traditional hunting grounds and seasonal camps throughout the region. They preferred isolation and did not appreciate visitors. Respecting that preference was essential. Aaron dismissed the warning as exaggerated caution. He thanked Jenkins, and Jenkins departed, leaving Aaron alone in the cabin as afternoon descended toward evening. The first weeks passed uneventfully. Aaron settled into a routine of reading, writing, and short explorations into the surrounding forest. He found a small stream, approximately half a mile from the cabin, and spent time there observing wildlife. He discovered various trails, presumably created by animal movement or perhaps by previous visitors to the cabin. The forest was beautiful in a way that Aaron had not anticipated, offering a sense of peace that he had sought but rarely found in his previous life. He felt for the first time in years as if he might have discovered a place where he could remain indefinitely. In the third week, Aaron encountered Jenkins unexpectedly. Jenkins had driven to the cabin to check on something in his truck that he had left there during the previous visit. Jenkins seemed startled to see Aaron in the cabin and asked how Aaron was settling in. Aaron replied that everything was fine, that he was enjoying the isolation and the peacefulness. Jenkins nodded, but then asked Aaron if he had ventured far into the forest, if he had encountered anything unusual. Aaron mentioned the stream and the wildlife observations, but nothing else. Jenkins seemed to relax slightly and told Aaron that he should stick to the areas relatively close to the cabin. The forest became stranger, more dangerous, the further one ventured from the cabin. Jenkins explained this with an intensity that suggested genuine concern rather than casual warning. Aaron asked Jenkins what exactly he meant by stranger, and Jenkins seemed to struggle with how to articulate his meaning. He eventually told Aaron that there were things in the forest that defied simple explanation, things that the Yupik peoples who had traditionally inhabited this region had warned about for generations, things that Jenkins himself had glimpsed but preferred not to discuss. After Jenkins left, Aaron found himself unsettled. He had chosen this location specifically to escape from the complications of human society, but Jenkins's warning suggested that isolation in Alaska carried different complications than simple solitude. He decided to honor the warning and confined his explorations to areas within sight of the cabin. Several days later, Aaron heard sounds emanating from the forest at night. Not animal sounds, or not entirely. They were rhythmic, almost musical, but with something discordant woven through the rhythm. Voices perhaps chanting in a language that Aaron did not recognize. The sounds would continue for an hour or more and then cease abruptly. When Aaron ventured into the forest the following morning to investigate, he found no evidence of habitation, no footprints, no discarded materials, no indication that anyone had been present. The sounds continued intermittently over the following weeks. Aaron found himself growing accustomed to them, even anticipating them. There was something almost meditative about the strange chanting, something that resonated with Aaron on a level he could not quite articulate. He began recording the sounds using a basic audio recorder, capturing several hours of the chanting to review and analyze later. When Aaron eventually played the recordings back during the day, in the calm light of afternoon, Something about them seemed to shift his perspective. The chanting was hypnotic. The more he listened, the more he felt drawn back into the forest, deeper than he had previously ventured, seeking the source of the sounds. He left the cabin on a morning in early October and walked into the forest, following nothing in particular, simply allowing his instincts to guide him. After several hours of walking, he discovered a structure that should not have existed. It was a dwelling of some kind, constructed from wood and stone, but with an architecture that did not match anything Aaron had encountered in his research about Alaskan indigenous peoples. The structure seemed partially buried in the earth, with only its upper portions visible above the forest floor. The entrance was framed with carved symbols that appeared extremely old, weathered by time and exposure. Aaron approached the entrance and peered inside. The interior was dark, but as his eyes adjusted, he could make out shapes. A figure stood in the center of the space, motionless. Aaron's mind struggled to process what he was observing. The figure was tall, perhaps 7 feet in height, with proportions that were subtly wrong. The arms seemed too long. The head seemed too narrow. The skin, what Aaron could perceive of it in the dimness, seemed to have an unusual texture, almost translucent. Aaron ran. He did not think about it or make a conscious decision. His body simply reacted, and he found himself crashing through the forest, branches tearing at his clothing, his lungs burning with exertion. He ran until the structure was no longer visible behind him, then continued running until he recognized landmarks that indicated proximity to the cabin. When he finally reached the cabin and locked himself inside, his heart was racing so violently that he thought it might burst from his chest. He called Jenkins immediately. He told Jenkins what he had encountered, describing the structure and the figure inside. Jenkins was silent for a long moment, then told Aaron that he needed to leave the cabin immediately. He needed to pack whatever belongings he had brought and leave now. Jenkins would be driving out to collect him within the hour. Aaron did as instructed. He packed his minimal possessions and waited for Jenkins, who arrived exactly 1 hour later, looking visibly agitated. Jenkins did not ask Aaron to elaborate on what he had witnessed. Instead, Jenkins drove rapidly back toward town, while Aaron sat in the passenger seat trying to process what had happened. When they reached the town, Jenkins told Aaron that the rental cabin was no longer available. He informed Aaron that he would be returning his deposit in full, but that Aaron could not return to the property under any circumstances. Jenkins explained with obvious reluctance that the cabin existed in an area where phenomena occurred that defied conventional understanding. The previous renters had reported similar experiences. One had attempted to investigate the structure Aaron had discovered and had returned to the cabin in a state of advanced psychological distress. That renter had been evacuated by helicopter and had spent 6 months in a psychiatric facility before being released with no diagnosis or explanation for his condition. Jenkins had debated whether to continue renting the cabin at all, but had decided to maintain it simply to ensure that it could be monitored. The presence of renters, Jenkins hoped, might deter whatever inhabited the structure. Aaron returned to Juneau and attempted to resume his previous life, but he found himself fundamentally altered by the experience. He could not stop thinking about the figure in the structure, about the ancient dwelling in the forest, about Jenkins's implications that indigenous peoples had warned about such phenomena for generations. He conducted research into Yupik folklore and discovered references to beings that inhabited remote areas, creatures that existed somewhere between human and something else. Some sources called them the Irchenrat, the little people, though Aaron's encounter suggested something far larger. Other sources referenced entities that lured people deeper into the wilderness, that called to humans with sounds and voices, that existed in spaces between the understood and the unknowable. He tried to contact Jenkins several times to discuss what he had experienced, but Jenkins refused to speak with him. Jenkins' number eventually became disconnected. When Aaron attempted to visit Jenkins' house, he found it abandoned. A neighbor informed Aaron that Jenkins had sold his property and relocated to southern Alaska, telling no one his destination. Aaron still lives in Juneau, but he no longer ventures into the wilderness. He works a job in town and maintains a routine that keeps him within familiar boundaries. He no longer seeks solitude in the way he once did. Instead, he has recognized that some forms of isolation are dangerous, that some places exist outside the boundaries of human understanding, and that certain warnings should be heeded regardless of one's desire for escape. He still has the audio recordings of the chanting, backed up in multiple locations. Sometimes late at night, when he cannot sleep, he listens to them and feels the old pull, the urge to return to that cabin, to venture deeper into the forest, to seek out that structure and confront whatever inhabited it. But he resists the urge, understanding now that some curiosity, once indulged, creates a permanent hunger that can never be fully satisfied. The cabin, he learned through oblique inquiries, eventually burned down in a forest fire 3 years after his departure. The cause of the fire was never determined. No investigation was conducted. The property was not rebuilt. Sometimes the forest, Aaron has concluded, cleanses itself of things that do not belong within its boundaries. The Meridian Diner had been operating continuously since 1982, a roadside establishment located at the intersection of two modest highways, approximately 30 miles northeast of Fairbanks. It was the kind of place that existed in the margins of Alaska, frequenting traveled by locals and occasional tourists seeking authentic frontier atmosphere. The building was constructed of weathered wood and fading paint, with a sign that flickered sporadically at night, and a parking lot that usually held between 3 and 8 vehicles. Hazel had worked the night shift at the Meridian for 3 years. She was 28 years old, competent at her work, and preferred the night shift to day work because it offered fewer customers and less social interaction. She took her job seriously, kept the diner clean, maintained the coffee fresh, and treated customers with professional courtesy despite her natural inclination toward solitude. She had no particular ambitions beyond maintaining her apartment and keeping her life uncomplicated. The other night shift staff had changed frequently. Dishwashers, prep cooks, and additional servers came and went with surprising regularity. Hazel had learned not to develop attachments to her temporary colleagues, as most seemed to view the night shift as a temporary stepping stone rather than permanent employment. But in the past 18 months, a pattern had emerged among the departing staff. Several had quit abruptly, offering only vague explanations about feeling unsafe or uncomfortable. One, a woman named Michelle, had simply stopped showing up for her shift and had not answered her phone when the restaurant manager attempted to contact her. Michelle had never returned to collect her final paycheck. Flores had begun working at the Meridian approximately 4 months prior to the timeline of this account. He was a man, perhaps 50 years old, with weathered features and an unusual quality to his eyes that suggested depth of experience, or perhaps psychological disruption. He was employed as a regular evening and night shift customer, not staff, though the distinction seemed irrelevant given the frequency and consistency of his presence. He arrived at approximately 9 in the evening and remained until the diner closed at 2 in the morning. He ordered the same meal each night, coffee and a piece of pie, and sat at the counter, observing the other patrons. Hazel noted his presence initially as merely another regular, the kind of person who existed in every 24-hour establishment. But as weeks progressed, she became aware of his focused attention on her. Not the casual observation that any patron might engage in, but something more deliberate. He watched her movements. He timed her breaks. He noted her interactions with other staff members, and occasionally he would say things that suggested knowledge beyond what he could have acquired through observation during his diner visits. He mentioned once, in a conversational tone, that Hazel had been seeing someone named Thomas, though Hazel had not mentioned this person to anyone at the restaurant. Another time, He referenced Hazel's apartment location, suggesting he knew the street and building number, though she had never discussed her living situation with anyone at the diner. When Hazel directly asked him how he possessed this information, Flores simply smiled and told her that he made it a practice to know things about people. He found it useful. Hazel began feeling genuinely frightened by Flores's presence. She requested to work only the early evening shifts rather than the full night shift, hoping to avoid him. Her manager, puzzled by the request, accommodated it for approximately 1 week before staffing requirements forced Hazel back to the full night shift. Her manager was unsympathetic to her concerns about Flores, pointing out that he was a paying customer who never caused problems and who consistently left adequate tips. It was approximately 2 weeks after her forced return to the night shift that Hazel discovered the missing persons posters. She found them while cleaning the storage area behind the restaurant, tucked in a box beneath old paperwork and forgotten supplies. The posters were aging, the photographs yellowed and curling at the edges. They featured faces of young women and men, all labeled with names and dates of disappearance. Most were dated between 5 and 15 years previously. Several of the faces seemed vaguely familiar, and Hazel eventually realized why. They matched photographs that Flores kept in his truck. Photographs that she had glimpsed through his truck window while leaving the restaurant after a shift approximately 2 weeks prior. Hazel brought the posters to her manager and asked about them. Her manager, visibly uncomfortable, explained that they had been left behind by a previous employee and that he kept them in storage rather than displaying them out of respect for the families. He had not investigated the connection between the posters and Flores because he had no concrete reason to suspect anything inappropriate. Flores was simply a customer. The posters were old. Coincidence likely explained any connection. Hazel contacted the Fairbanks Police Department directly. She provided them with descriptions of Flores's vehicle, license plate number, and detailed accounts of his suspicious behavior. She explained the connection between the missing persons posters and the photographs in his vehicle. She expressed her belief that Flores posed a threat to the restaurant staff. The police response was frustratingly minimal. An officer came to the restaurant and took a report. He examined the missing persons posters and noted that while the cases were old and cold, the missing persons had all been located or their cases had been resolved through other means. The officer explained that transporting missing persons posters was not inherently illegal. Having photographs that resembled missing persons was not inherently criminal. Observing restaurant staff was not inherently threatening. Without evidence of a specific crime or direct threat, there was little the police could investigate. Hazel felt profoundly unsupported. She called in sick for several shifts, desperate to avoid Flores, but her financial situation did not permit extended absences from work, and after 4 days, she returned. When she entered the diner for her shift, Flores was already seated at the counter, his coffee and pie arranged before him exactly as they always were. He looked directly at her and smiled. He told her that he had noticed her absence, that he hoped she was well, and that it was good to see her again. He spoke with complete normalcy, as if their previous interactions held no significance, but his tone carried an undercurrent of something else, something that suggested he was aware that she had reported him to the police and that such reporting had been ineffectual. Over the following weeks, Flores continued his nightly visits. His behavior never escalated into anything overtly threatening, but his presence became increasingly suffocating. Hazel found herself unable to focus on her work when he was present. She struggled to sleep during her daytime hours. She became hyper-aware of her surroundings during her drive to and from work. She experienced profound anxiety at the beginning of each shift, wondering if he would be present, and profound anxiety even when he was not, wondering why his absence seemed more threatening than his presence. Hazel began keeping a detailed journal of Flores's statements and observations, documenting everything he said or did. She maintained meticulous records of dates, times, and any reference to information he should not have possessed. She contacted the police again, providing them with this documentation. The officer who received her report was sympathetic, but explained that the documentation, while concerning, did not constitute legal evidence of criminal activity. The officer suggested that Hazel consider obtaining a restraining order, though he explained that the likelihood of success would depend on demonstrating a direct threat, which had not yet occurred. Before Hazel could pursue the restraining order, Flores simply stopped appearing. His nightly visits ceased abruptly. Days passed without his presence, then weeks. The diner staff, particularly Hazel, experienced an almost surreal sense of relief mixed with uncertainty. Had he simply relocated? Had he lost interest? Had someone, perhaps an acquaintance of one of the missing persons, finally confronted him? But the cessation of his presence did not bring peace to Hazel. Instead, it transformed her fear into something different, something that the initial threat had not produced. She found herself unable to feel safe anywhere. She saw his face in crowds. She heard his voice when walking past strangers. She experienced panic attacks when encountering men of his approximate age or appearance. Her anxiety gradually evolved into a chronic condition that persisted despite his absence. She eventually left her job at the Meridian and relocated to Anchorage, seeking distance from the diner and from the memory of Flores's presence. She obtained employment at a different restaurant and attempted to rebuild a sense of normalcy, but she never fully recovered from the experience. She remained hypervigilant, watching for signs of threat, unable to fully trust her own safety. 3 years after Flores' disappearance from the Meridian, a woman escaped from a property in the rural areas surrounding Fairbanks. She reported that she had been held captive for approximately 18 months by a man matching Flores' description. She described a structure where multiple women had been held, where she had not been allowed to leave, where she had experienced treatment that she would not detail publicly. She identified Flores from photographs, providing the authorities with the identification they needed. But when police attempted to locate the property based on her descriptions, they could not locate it. The woman's identification of the location was imprecise. Her descriptions of roads and landmarks were inconsistent, as if memory itself had been altered. The case ultimately became one more unsolved disappearance, one more story that police could not substantiate. Hazel read the news accounts and experienced a combination of relief and renewed horror. She contacted the escaped woman through intermediaries and attempted to provide support and information, but the woman seemed unable to engage in substantive conversation about her experience. She appeared to be functioning at minimal psychological capacity, as if whatever had occurred to her had fundamentally altered her ability to interact with the world. Hazel still lives in Anchorage. She works in retail rather than restaurants, avoiding any employment that would involve night shift work. She has undergone therapy, attempting to process the trauma of Flores's presence and the violation of being known and observed without her consent. She has developed an understanding that her fear, while perhaps excessive from an external perspective, was not unfounded. Flores was real. His threat was real. That he was never prosecuted did not diminish the reality of his danger. The Meridian Diner continues to operate. The night shift staff continues to change with frequency. Whether Flores ever returns remains unknown. But Hazel has learned that some predators exist in the margins of civilization, moving between communities, selecting victims from among those who work the marginal shifts where oversight is minimal and accountability is sparse. Some fears, she has concluded, are warnings that should be heeded rather than overcome. Thomas had spent 15 years conducting glaciological research in Alaska. He was a respected scientist, published in peer-reviewed journals, acknowledged as an expert in the study of glacial retreat and climate change impacts on polar ice sheets. At 46 years old, he had lived through a period of dramatic environmental change, witnessing firsthand the accelerating collapse of systems that had remained relatively stable for millennia. His work was not glamorous, but it was meaningful, and he had dedicated his career to understanding processes that few people cared to examine. The research expedition began in late June, when the brief Alaskan summer window provided access to glacial fields that remained inaccessible during the rest of the year. Thomas had assembled a team of 3 researchers for the season-long project. 2 had worked with him previously. The third was an unknown element, a man named Perry, whom Thomas had recruited through professional channels after one of his intended team members had to withdraw due to personal circumstances. Perry arrived at the Anchorage airport with minimal equipment and a great deal of enthusiasm. He was perhaps 5 years Thomas's senior, with an athletic build and a manner that suggested military background or similar disciplined experience. His credentials were impeccable. His publications were published in the same journals that Thomas published in. His CV suggested he was qualified for the position. Thomas felt no particular concern about bringing him into the research team. The research station was located on an elevated plateau approximately 60 miles from Denali, positioned to provide access to multiple glacier systems that required seasonal monitoring. The station itself was a modular structure constructed of insulated panels containing lab equipment, sample storage, and basic living quarters. A generator provided power. Satellite communication provided contact with the outside world. The isolation was profound, but not extreme. Supply trucks arrived once every 3 weeks. Emergency extraction was theoretically possible if circumstances required it. The first 2 weeks proceeded normally. The team conducted measurements, collected ice cores, documented thermal imaging data. Perry contributed meaningfully to the work, showing competence in the field and familiarity with the research methodologies. Thomas found himself relaxing his initial guardedness. Perry seemed competent and professional. Then Perry began asking unusual questions. He inquired about the history of the research station, about previous research teams, about whether anything unusual had ever been observed. Thomas answered straightforwardly, noting that glaciological work was inherently unusual and that the environment regularly produced phenomena that seemed remarkable but which science could eventually explain. Perry seemed unsatisfied with this response. He pressed further, asking about local indigenous knowledge about whether the Athabascan peoples who traditionally occupied this region had any warnings about the area. Thomas mentioned that he was unfamiliar with specific traditional knowledge related to the glacier region, but acknowledged that indigenous peoples throughout Alaska maintained cultural knowledge about their territories. Perry became notably interested in this admission. He asked Thomas if the station had any records or archives related to previous research activities or local history. Thomas checked the station's limited Librarian files, discovering that a previous research team from the 1970s had documented observations of what they called unusual atmospheric phenomena and electromagnetic anomalies. The documentation was vague, suggesting that the researchers had been uncertain how to characterize what they were observing. They had noted that their instruments frequently malfunctioned, that compass readings were unreliable, and that team members occasionally reported disorientation or memory lapses. The team that had compiled these notes suggested that the phenomena might be related to geological features of the region, possibly magnetic deposits or unusual mineral formations. Nothing conclusive had resulted from their investigation. Perry read these notes with intense focus. He asked Thomas detailed questions about the locations where the phenomena had been observed, about the dates and seasons, about whether any team members had reported physical symptoms. Thomas answered as thoroughly as possible, but became increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of Perry's inquiry. He asked Perry directly why he was so interested in records from a period of research conducted decades earlier. Perry deflected the question, stating only that he was interested in the comprehensive history of the site. Approximately 1 week later, Thomas woke during the night to find Perry missing from the station. This was concerning for multiple reasons. Weather conditions outside were poor, with wind gusts exceeding 40 miles per hour and visibility severely reduced by fog and precipitation. No one ventured outside the station during such conditions without explicit emergency justification. Thomas searched the station thoroughly and discovered that Perry had dressed in cold weather gear and had taken one of the portable satellite communication devices. Thomas waited for approximately 1 hour, then attempted to contact Perry using the remaining satellite phone. Perry did not respond. Thomas prepared to go out to search for him despite the treacherous conditions, but as he was gathering equipment, Perry returned to the station. He was covered in ice, his clothing soaked despite the protective gear, and he was shaking violently, either from cold or from something else. Thomas immediately moved Perry into the heated living quarters and stripped away the wet clothing. He provided warm blankets and hot beverages. When Perry had stabilized physically, Thomas demanded to know what Perry had been doing outside in such conditions. Perry was initially incoherent, muttering about structures and light and voices. Eventually, he managed to provide a more coherent account. He claimed that he had observed lights in the distance, unusual lights that seemed to be emanating from within the glacial field. He had gone to investigate and had discovered what he described as a geometric structure embedded in the ice, a structure that appeared to be artificial rather than natural. Thomas assumed Perry was suffering from altitude sickness or cold-induced delirium. Such symptoms could produce hallucinations and confused reasoning. He told Perry to rest and said he would examine the area where Perry claimed to have observed the lights during daylight hours and improved conditions. Perry became distressed at this, insisting that the structure could not be explained through conventional geology, that something about it was fundamentally wrong, that Thomas needed to see it, but needed to be prepared for what he would encounter. Thomas was thoroughly alarmed by Perry's mental state. He attempted to use the satellite phone to contact the research station administrative center in Anchorage, hoping to arrange emergency medical evacuation. The satellite phone would not function. The communication system, which had been operating reliably throughout the expedition, had apparently failed. Thomas attempted to repair it, but could not identify any obvious malfunction. The device simply would not transmit or receive signals. When weather conditions improved the following day, Thomas ventured toward the location where Perry claimed to have seen the lights. He brought the portable GPS unit and recording equipment, determined to document whether anything unusual existed in the indicated location. He discovered the area Perry had described, but he found no artificial structures, no lights, no evidence of anything beyond normal glacial features and formations. He spent several hours documenting the area with photographs and detailed notes, intending to demonstrate to Perry that his observations had been imaginary. When Thomas returned to the research station, he found Perry packing his equipment. Perry stated that he needed to leave immediately. He explained that he had made a mistake in joining this research project, that he had been looking for something specific and had found evidence that it existed here, but that pursuing the matter further would be dangerous. He was departing on foot toward the highway, despite the remote location and challenging terrain. Thomas attempted to convince Perry to remain at the station until the supply truck arrived in approximately 1 week, but Perry was adamant. He departed the station on foot with minimal supplies, moving in the direction of the distant highway. Thomas reported Perry's departure to the station administrative center via satellite phone, which had inexplicably begun functioning again following Perry's departure. He provided descriptions of Perry's physical condition and direction of travel, noting concerns about Perry's mental health and the likelihood that rescue would be required. The administrative center acknowledged the report and indicated that they would contact local authorities. Perry was never found. No rescue teams located him. No evidence of his passage toward the highway was ever documented. The administrative center reported that Perry had officially terminated his research position through a terse email notification sent from an internet cafe in Anchorage 2 weeks after his departure from the station. The email provided no explanation and no forwarding information. Thomas completed the research season with the remaining team members. The research proceeded normally from that point forward. No additional unusual phenomena were observed. The equipment functioned reliably. The team collected the necessary data to support continued publication and research development. But Thomas never returned to the research station. He completed the data analysis and publication process remotely, and he transferred to a different research position, one that did not require extended presence in remote locations. His colleagues noted that he seemed changed by the expedition, less enthusiastic about fieldwork, and more inclined to pursue theoretical research conducted from university laboratories. Years later, while reviewing archived research documents from the 1970s research team, Thomas discovered something he had not previously noticed. One of the team members from that earlier expedition bore a remarkable physical resemblance to Perry. The name was different, but the photographs were nearly identical. The team member from the 1970s had been reported missing at the end of that research season and had never been located. Thomas attempted to investigate further, contacting family members of the missing researcher, but he discovered that records related to the 1970s expedition had been archived in a manner that made comprehensive research difficult. Official channels did not provide details about the missing researcher's disappearance, and informal inquiries met with resistance from university administrators who seemed disinterested in reopening historical cases. Thomas now lives in Oregon, far from Alaska, conducting theoretical research that requires no fieldwork and no interaction with the research locations that had defined his career. He maintains the data he collected from the research station. He keeps the photographs he took of the glacial field, where Perry claimed to see lights and structures. But he has never attempted to return to the location or to definitively establish whether what Perry had encountered was real or was something far more disturbing, a phenomenon that operated outside the boundaries of conventional scientific explanation. Some mysteries, Thomas has concluded, are safer left unexplained. Some research stations, once they have attracted certain attention, should not be revisited. And sometimes the researchers themselves become part of the mystery they are investigating. Claire was 32 years old when her sister vanished. The disappearance of Rebecca, who was then 17 years old, had consumed Claire's life for the subsequent 15 years. Rebecca had been walking home from a friend's house on an autumn evening in Bethel, Alaska, a town of approximately 6,000 residents located on the Kuskokwim River. She had followed her usual route, a path that took her through a residential neighborhood and a short section of forested area before reaching the family home. She had never arrived. A search had been conducted, dogs had been deployed, the woods had been thoroughly combed. No evidence of Rebecca's fate had ever been discovered. The case had eventually gone cold, relegated to the filing cabinets of unsolved disappearances that occurred with unsettling frequency in Alaska. Claire had never accepted this resolution. She had dedicated herself to the case, conducting her own investigations, reviewing police reports, interviewing people who had been present in the area at the time of Rebecca's disappearance. She had become something of an amateur investigator, though her efforts had yielded little concrete progress. Police had been understanding but had eventually been obliged to tell her that without new evidence or information, there was nothing further they could investigate. The case remained officially open, but was for all practical purposes closed. Then, 15 years after Rebecca's disappearance, Claire received a contact through social media. A man named Powell claimed to have information about Rebecca. He suggested they meet in person to discuss what he knew. Claire, desperate for any development in her sister's case, agreed to meet Powell at a public location, a coffee shop in Bethel where she still lived. Powell was a man perhaps 60 years old, weathered and somewhat haggard. He explained to Claire that he had been acquainted with people who had information about what had happened to Rebecca. He suggested that her sister had not been killed in the conventional sense. Rather, she had been taken to a location and held there for a period of time before being transferred elsewhere. Powell's knowledge of the situation seemed specific and detailed, though he was evasive about his exact source of information. Claire pressed him for specifics. Powell explained that he could not provide all details, but he could tell her that Rebecca was likely still alive at the time she had been transferred, though her subsequent fate was unknown. He mentioned a property in the rural areas outside Bethel where temporary confinement had occurred. He provided approximate coordinates and a description of a structure that matched none of the buildings Claire had ever heard referenced in police reports. Claire immediately reported Powell's information to the Bethel Police Department. She provided them with Powell's name and the details he had shared. The police response was infuriatingly non-committal. Officers explained that Powell's claims were unsubstantiated, that the property he described could not be located with any precision, and that without specific evidence linking Powell to Rebecca's disappearance, they could not investigate him. They did, however, interview Powell. When Powell was confronted with police questioning, his entire demeanor shifted. He became evasive and contradictory. He claimed he had been speaking hypothetically, that he had no actual knowledge of what had happened to Rebecca. He suggested he had approached Claire seeking reward money and had fabricated information to that end. When confronted with the possibility that he had knowledge of a crime, Powell invoked his right to legal representation and ceased speaking to police. Without concrete evidence or a confession, police released Powell. Claire felt profound frustration and betrayal at this outcome. She attempted to follow Powell to observe his activities and gather evidence that police might act upon, but Powell seemed aware that he was being monitored. He altered his routines. He took circuitous routes through town. He eventually disappeared entirely, leaving Bethel without notification or explanation. When Claire attempted to locate Powell through various means, she discovered that his provided information had been false. The name Powell was apparently an alias. His social media account had been created with falsified details. His address in Fairbanks, which he had provided to police, belonged to a house that had been vacant for 2 years. There was no employment history that could be verified. It was as if Powell had existed solely for the purpose of meeting with Claire. Claire reported this discovery to police. They explained that while unusual, the situation was not inherently criminal. An individual had approached her with information that turned out to be unreliable. This happened with some frequency in cases involving missing persons. Without evidence of deception with intent to harm, there was nothing actionable. Over the following months, Claire found herself receiving occasional communications from individuals who claimed to have information about Rebecca. Each communication would provide tantalizing details that seemed promising initially, but would prove impossible to verify or substantiate upon investigation. One person claimed to have seen Rebecca in a photograph with specific identifying marks. When Claire obtained the photograph, it proved to be unrelated to Rebecca. Another person claimed to have recovered Rebecca's personal effects from a thrift store. When the items were examined, they were not Rebecca's, but belonged to a different person entirely. These communications eventually ceased, leaving Claire with the sense that someone had been deliberately manipulating her, providing false hope for purposes that remained obscure. She consulted with a therapist about the possibility that she was experiencing paranoid thinking or was developing false memories. The therapist suggested that her fixation on her sister's case, while understandable, was becoming counterproductive to her mental health and well-being. Claire attempted to move forward with her life. She focused on her career, developing a professional practice as a dental hygienist. She began dating, She attempted to rebuild a sense of normalcy that did not center around her sister's disappearance, but she remained unable to fully release her connection to the case. She maintained a notebook detailing all information related to Rebecca's disappearance. She continued to monitor Alaska missing persons cases, searching for patterns that might connect to Rebecca's circumstances. 9 years after Powell's initial contact, Claire was approached at her workplace by a woman who claimed to be a journalist investigating missing persons cases in Alaska. The journalist, whose name was Sarah, explained that she had discovered patterns in multiple disappearances across Alaska that suggested possible connections between cases that official investigations had not considered. She had identified Rebecca's case as potentially connected to a larger pattern. She was interviewing families and developing a comprehensive account of what she believed was a systematic operation spanning decades. Claire provided Sarah with all of her research and documentation. Sarah seemed genuinely interested in the information and promised to explore the connections thoroughly. She explained that she was working with law enforcement contacts who had informal influence, and that she might be able to facilitate new investigation of Rebecca's case if she could demonstrate sufficient connection to other cases. Sarah's investigation appeared to generate initial interest. She reported that law enforcement was beginning to take the patterns seriously. She indicated that multiple agencies were coordinating to examine the connection between cases, but these promising developments suddenly ceased. Sarah ceased responding to Claire's communications. Sarah's social media accounts were deleted. Inquiries about Sarah's investigation yielded no results. It was as if Sarah had disappeared as mysteriously as Rebecca. Claire eventually learned through indirect means that Sarah had relocated out of state and was no longer involved in investigative work related to missing persons cases. No investigation was ever formally opened into the patterns that Sarah had identified. The cases Sarah had flagged remained filed separately in official records, with no officially acknowledged connection between them. Claire now lives in Anchorage, having relocated from Bethel in the hope that distance might provide perspective and relief from her obsession with Rebecca's case. But she continues to maintain her research and documentation. She continues to receive occasional communications from individuals claiming to have information about Rebecca, though she has learned to view such communications with suspicion. She has come to understand that her sister's disappearance, like many disappearances in Alaska, exists in a zone where investigation is actively discouraged, where those who pursue information are provided with false leads and then abandoned when they attempt to verify the leads. She has concluded that something exists in that zone, something that operates outside the boundaries of conventional law enforcement, something that prefers that certain cases remain unsolved. Rebecca, Claire believes, is part of that something. Whether her sister is still alive after 15 years of disappearance is something Claire can no longer hope to determine. Whether the information provided by Powell and Sarah was genuine or deliberately misleading is something Claire will likely never know. What Claire does know is that the system designed to investigate and solve disappearances is itself compromised at points where genuine investigation becomes too close to certain truths. And some mysteries she has accepted are constructed and maintained deliberately, protected by mechanisms that are far more sophisticated than a simple cover-up or conspiracy. Her sister remains missing, and in Alaska, where vast distances and sparse population make accountability inherently difficult, the missing frequently remain missing. Charles had secured employment at the Kaltag logging operation during the spring of 2014. The position paid better than comparable work in larger towns, and the isolation appealed to him. He was a man in his mid-30s, quiet, preferring solitude to social entanglement. The logging camp was situated in the remote interior, approximately 100 miles from the nearest settlement. The operation employed approximately 30 people, housed in dormitory-style accommodations on the company property. Work was seasonal, with most operational activity occurring during spring and summer months when the forest roads became passable. Charles had worked at logging camps before, understood the rhythms of the work, knew how to conduct himself in environments where isolation could breed tension and conflict. The Kaltag operation was run with military efficiency by a manager named Ramirez, a man perhaps 50 years old with a background in construction management and an almost ruthless approach to productivity. Ramirez was not cruel in an obvious manner, but he was demanding and expected that workers would prioritize the company's interests above all other considerations. Charles noticed immediately that the camp's staff exhibited high turnover. Workers would arrive, work for a few months, and then depart with little explanation. Some would simply vanish, ceasing to appear for their work assignments without providing notice or explanation. Ramirez would note their departure with no particular concern, simply assigning their work responsibilities to remaining staff. When Charles inquired about the departures, Ramirez explained that turnover was normal in seasonal work. Some workers discovered that they did not enjoy isolated work. Others received better offers from competing operations. The reasons varied. The departures were unremarkable. But as spring progressed into summer, Charles began observing patterns that suggested the departures were less voluntary than Ramirez's explanations implied. He noticed that certain workers seemed to exhibit changes in behavior immediately before they departed. Their demeanor would shift. They would become withdrawn, or conversely overly animated. They would avoid eye contact with other workers. They would consume unusual quantities of food or would refuse to eat at all. Within days of exhibiting these behavioral changes, they would disappear. Charles mentioned his observations to another worker named Michael, a man approximately his own age who had been working at the camp for nearly a year. Michael's response was immediate and urgent. He pulled Charles away from the dormitory, leading him into the forest, well away from the camp structures. Michael explained with obvious anxiety that Charles was observing something he should not be observing. He instructed Charles not to ask questions, not to discuss his observations with anyone, and most importantly, not to investigate further. Charles pressed Michael for explanation. Michael eventually reluctantly provided a partial account. He suggested that something was occurring at the camp related to the disappearances, something that involved Ramirez and possibly other camp management. He suggested that the workers who disappeared had not actually left the property, but had been taken somewhere, and that Charles would be wise to leave the camp immediately if he valued his safety. Charles asked what had happened to the disappeared workers. Michael would not answer. He told Charles only that he could not provide details, but that he had almost been included in whatever process had claimed the other workers. He had survived only through a combination of circumstances and sheer fortune. He was now counting the days until his contract expired, at which point he would leave and never return. Michael's warning disturbed Charles profoundly, but it did not motivate him to leave. Instead, it motivated him to investigate. He understood the risks, but felt compelled to discover what was actually occurring at the facility. He began observing Ramirez's activities more carefully. He noted when Ramirez spent time away from the main camp operations, in which direction he traveled, how long his absences lasted. Charles discovered that Ramirez maintained a structure approximately half a mile from the main camp, concealed within the dense forest. The structure was small, constructed of materials that suggested it had been built recently. Charles approached it carefully during a time when he knew Ramirez was engaged elsewhere at the camp. He discovered that the structure was locked, but through a small window, he could see contents that triggered immediate alarm. Personal items were stored within the structure. Wallets, jewelry, clothing, items that appeared to have belonged to the disappeared workers. Charles photographed the visible contents using his phone camera. He documented the location using GPS coordinates. He then withdrew from the area, intending to leave the camp immediately and report what he had discovered to authorities. But that evening, Ramirez approached Charles at the dormitory. Ramirez's manner was cordial, but something in his expression suggested knowledge of Charles's activities. Ramirez explained that he had a special project that required Charles's particular skills. He asked Charles to report to the forest structure the following morning, prepared for heavy work. Charles attempted to decline, explaining that he was not feeling well. Ramirez's response was understanding but insistent. He explained that the project was important to the company and that Charles would be compensated additionally for his participation. Charles spent a sleepless night. He considered simply departing the camp, driving away during darkness, disappearing before morning. But he recognized that departing under such circumstances would place him in immediate danger. Ramirez knew where he lived, knew his family's location, would certainly pursue him if he fled. Charles decided that his better option was to comply with the request, to ascertain what was occurring, and to find opportunity to contact authorities. The following morning, Charles reported to the forest structure. Ramirez was present, along with two other men whom Charles had not seen previously at the camp. They appeared to be visiting consultants or contractors. Ramirez explained that they required Charles's help moving materials from the structure. They loaded Charles' truck with sealed containers and boxes, providing no explanation of the contents. They instructed Charles to transport the materials to a specific location approximately 50 miles distant, where other individuals would receive the delivery. Charles complied. He drove to the designated location and discovered that another company operation was present at that location. The materials were offloaded and reseated by individuals who appeared to be part of a larger organizational structure. Charles was paid for the transport and instructed to return to the Kaltag camp. Upon returning to the camp, Charles understood with perfect clarity that he had become involved in something far more significant than he had initially suspected. Whatever was occurring at Kaltag involved multiple operations, coordinated logistics, and structured organizational hierarchy. The disappeared workers had not simply vanished randomly. They had been processed in some manner, their personal effects collected and stored, their bodies or their current locations unknown, but certainly not simply abandoned. Charles reported sick the following day. He informed Ramirez that he required time to rest and recover. Ramirez agreed and told Charles to take whatever time was necessary. Charles spent that day planning his escape. He gathered his belongings and organized his financial resources. That evening, he departed the camp in his truck, driving through the night toward the nearest settlement. When Charles reached the settlement of Koyukuk the following morning, he immediately went to the police station and provided a formal report of his suspicions. He explained about the disappeared workers, the hidden structure, the personal effects stored within it, the transport of mysterious materials to other locations. He provided coordinates, photographs, and the names of individuals involved. The police response was initially professional. Officers took his statement and indicated they would investigate his claims. But as the investigation proceeded, Charles detected a shift in official attention. The investigation seemed to progress but produced no results. Police explained that they had visited the forest structure at Kaltag and had found it empty. No personal effects were present. No evidence of illicit activity was discovered. Regarding the disappeared workers, police explained that turnover at seasonal employment was routine, and that without evidence of foul play, they could not investigate further. Charles requested that police pursue the matter more thoroughly. He offered to provide additional details and to cooperate fully with investigation, but the investigating officers seemed to lose interest in the case. They ultimately informed Charles that their investigation had concluded and that no evidence of criminal activity had been discovered at the Kaltag operation. Charles left Alaska several months later. He relocated to Oregon and obtained employment in an unrelated field. He attempted to move forward with his life, but he remained aware that he had witnessed something significant and that reporting it had produced no measurable result. 2 years after Charles's departure from Caltag, a worker at a competing logging operation in British Columbia escaped from captivity. The worker reported that he had been held with approximately 15 other individuals in an underground facility located beneath a logging camp. He described a systematic operation involving sedation, confinement, and what he described as medical procedures. The worker had escaped when a guard had been negligent in securing his accommodation. He reported the situation to Canadian authorities, who mounted a raid on the facility. However, when authorities arrived, they discovered that the facility had been dismantled. No evidence of captivity remained. No workers were found. The facility appeared to have been abandoned recently but systematically. Authorities could find no connection between the facility and the American logging operation where Charles had worked. Charles eventually became aware of this incident through news reports and understood with terrible certainty that the operation he had discovered at Caltag was part of a larger, systematic structure spanning multiple jurisdictions and multiple companies. The disappeared workers had not remained at Caltag. They had been transported, moved through the logistics network that Charles had briefly participated in, and delivered to some unknown destination for purposes that Charles could not fully comprehend. He has since attempted to share information about what he witnessed with various organizations and investigators. His reports have been received with polite skepticism or have been filed away without apparent further investigation. The Caltag logging operation continues to function. Ramirez continues to manage the facility. Workers continue to arrive seasonally and occasionally disappear without explanation or investigation. Charles lives now in a state of profound isolation, carrying knowledge of a systematic operation that authorities either cannot investigate or will not investigate. He has concluded that the operation exists within protected spaces, that powerful entities maintain interest in its continued function, and that attempting to expose it produces only isolation and frustration rather than accountability. He maintains detailed records of everything he witnessed. He keeps the photographs he took and the coordinates of the forest structure, but he has learned that evidence, without institutional support to investigate it, is merely documentation of a truth that the world has decided not to acknowledge. Some operations, Charles has concluded, continue functioning precisely because they have made themselves indispensable to systems of power that benefit from their existence. The disappeared workers become abstractions, missing person statistics in files that no one actively pursues. And those who witnessed what occurred become ghosts themselves, present but invisible, unable to generate the friction necessary to produce change. Paisley had always been drawn to travel. She was 24 years old, unencumbered by permanent relationships or employment obligations, possessed of that particular freedom that allowed her to spend months moving through the American landscape, documenting her journey through social media and video documentation. She was not wealthy, but she was resourceful, combining part-time work in various towns with modest savings to sustain her nomadic existence. She had been hitchhiking across the United States for approximately 2 years when she decided to venture to Alaska, drawn by the mythology of the frontier and the promise of landscapes that remained untouched by conventional tourism. Her plan was simple. She would hitch rides north from British Columbia into Alaska, spending 3 to 4 weeks exploring the Anchorage area and surrounding regions before heading back south for the approaching winter. She had researched safe practices for hitchhiking. She had informed friends and family of her general route. She had maintained communication with people in her support network throughout her travels. She believed herself adequately prepared for the risks that hitchhiking in remote areas inevitably carried. She was not prepared for Morris. Morris appeared at a roadside rest stop approximately 70 miles south of Anchorage, driving an old Ford pickup truck that had seen better years. He was a man perhaps 60 years old, with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent decades working outdoors. He was heading north toward Anchorage, he explained, and would be happy to provide Paisley with a ride. He had a granddaughter, approximately her age, living in Anchorage, and had always appreciated the company of young people during his drives. Paisley accepted the ride. Morris proved to be a competent conversationalist, asking questions about her travels, sharing stories about his own experiences in Alaska, offering practical advice about which areas were worth visiting and which areas were best avoided. He mentioned several small towns in the Turnagain Arm region, places that he suggested offered dramatic scenery and authentic Alaskan atmosphere without the commercial development of Anchorage. Approximately an hour into the drive, Morris suggested a slight detour. He explained that there was a viewpoint on a rough road branching off the highway that provided spectacular views of the Turnagain Arm. He had time, and he thought Paisley would appreciate the scenery. Paisley, trusting Morris's apparent harmlessness, agreed. The detour led them away from the highway onto progressively rougher roads. The landscape became increasingly remote. Eventually, they reached a point where the road became barely passable, more a collection of eroded tire tracks than an actual road. Morris pulled to a stop at a vantage point that did indeed provide views of the water and mountains in the distance. The location was isolated, with no other vehicles visible and no other structures within obvious sight. Morris turned to Paisley and asked her if she believed in fate. He suggested that some meetings were not random occurrences, but were predetermined by forces beyond human understanding. He mentioned that he had been driving this road regularly for the past several years, and he had been waiting for someone with her particular qualities to present themselves. He explained that he had been collecting information about people who hitchhiked in Alaska, and he had developed a map of locations where certain individuals had disappeared over the past decade. Paisley felt her instincts trigger alarm. She attempted to leave the vehicle, but Morris had locked the doors. He explained with apparent lack of hostility, but with absolute clarity, that she would not be leaving. He showed her a collection of maps and photographs that he maintained in the truck. The maps contained multiple marked locations throughout the Turnagain Arm region and surrounding areas. The photographs showed various individuals, some appearing to be alive in what looked like photographs taken against their will, others appearing in contexts that suggested they were no longer alive. Paisley recognized several faces from missing persons reports that she had seen circulating on social media and news outlets. She recognized a name that had appeared in national news coverage of an unsolved disappearance. She realized with perfect clarity that she was in the immediate presence of a predator, and that Morris's casual demeanor masked intentions that were fundamentally violent. Morris explained to Paisley that the marked locations represented sites where bodies had been disposed. He suggested that the locations were not random, but were part of a structured system. He indicated that he maintained regular contact with other individuals who engaged in similar activities, and that they had developed an informal network of disposal sites and practices that allowed them to operate without detection. He attempted to move toward Paisley. She responded by throwing herself against the vehicle door with enough force to shatter the window. She tumbled onto the rough ground and ran, abandoning her backpack and any possessions she had brought into the vehicle. She ran down the rough road back toward the highway, terrified that Morris would pursue her. Morris did not pursue her immediately. When Paisley looked back, she could see him standing beside his truck, apparently unconcerned with her flight. This absence of pursuit frightened her even more than active pursuit would have. It suggested that Morris was not afraid of her escape, that he possessed confidence that she would either return or that her escape would produce no meaningful consequences for him. Paisley made it back to the highway and flagged down a truck heading north toward Anchorage. She provided the driver with a frantic account of what had occurred and requested that he drive her directly to a police station. The driver, alarmed by her distress and her torn clothing from climbing through the vehicle window, complied. Paisley provided an extended statement to Anchorage police describing Morris, his vehicle, and the maps and photographs he had shown her. She provided the rough coordinates of the location where Morris had taken her. She described the marked locations on his maps with as much precision as she could recall. Police took the information seriously and indicated that they would investigate immediately. However, when police attempted to locate Morris or his vehicle, they discovered that tracking him proved impossible. The vehicle description matched dozens of used Ford pickups in the Anchorage area. The rough location that Paisley had provided was vast and imprecise. No individuals matching Morris's description were located through standard investigative channels. When police attempted to follow up on Paisley's claims by examining the marked locations she had identified, they found no evidence of human remains or burial sites at any of the identified coordinates. Police suggested to Paisley that she might have misinterpreted Morris's intentions, that he might have been making dark jokes rather than genuine confessions. They suggested that the maps and photographs she had described might have been unrelated to criminal activity, that Morris might have been engaged in legitimate research or hobbies that appeared sinister without proper context. They were sympathetic, but suggested that without evidence of a specific crime, they could not pursue investigation further. Paisley attempted to leave Alaska, but found herself unable to abandon the situation entirely. She contacted the police department multiple times, requesting updates on investigation efforts. She contacted missing persons organizations and provided them with descriptions of Morris and his vehicle. She posted her account on social media, detailing her experience and requesting information from others who might have had similar encounters. Her social media post generated responses from several individuals who claimed to have encountered Morris or someone matching his description. Some accounts suggested that Morris had picked up hitchhikers and had attempted to intimidate them with stories about disappearances. Other accounts suggested that Morris had taken people to isolated locations and that some of them had not returned. But each account was vague, secondhand, lacking the specificity that would allow police investigation. Paisley remained in Alaska for approximately 2 months longer, attempting to coordinate information and encourage police to pursue investigation more thoroughly. But she found that police attention to the matter was waning. No formal investigation was opened. No charges were filed. No arrest was made. Morris disappeared from public view, and Paisley was eventually forced to acknowledge that her experience, while genuinely terrifying, and while she believed Morris's statements were genuine confessions, had not generated sufficient evidence to support criminal prosecution. She eventually departed Alaska and returned to her previous traveling patterns, though her sense of security had been permanently altered. She no longer hitchhiked. She traveled by bus and by train, maintaining distance from drivers she did not know. She conducted research into serial killer cases in Alaska and discovered that Alaska had historically witnessed a disproportionate number of unsolved disappearances and documented serial killer cases compared to other states. She read accounts of investigations and recognized that many cases remained unsolved despite strong circumstantial evidence that killers often operated with apparent impunity in remote areas, and that official investigation of such cases was frequently inadequate. 3 years after her encounter with Morris, Paisley read a news account of a body being discovered in the Turnagain Arm region. The remains had been partially buried and had been exposed by erosion. The body was identified as belonging to an individual who had disappeared 8 years previously. The case attracted renewed attention from law enforcement, and police indicated they would be conducting renewed searches of the Turnagain Arm region for additional remains. These renewed searches did not produce results beyond the single discovered body. Police indicated that the renewed investigation had not identified any suspects connected to the disappearances. The case remained officially unsolved. Paisley has not returned to Alaska. She has never hitchhiked again. She has devoted a significant portion of her subsequent years to documenting missing persons cases in remote areas of the United States. attempting to identify patterns and to encourage investigation of cases that she believes official channels have abandoned. She maintains a database of individuals who she believes may have encountered Morris or individuals engaging in similar predatory behavior. She has shared this database with law enforcement agencies and with missing persons organizations. Her research has generated some interest from independent investigators and researchers, but it has not yet produced formal investigation or criminal charges. Morris remains unknown to her. She does not know if he was genuinely responsible for disappearances or if his statements were bluffs designed to frighten her. She does not know if he is still alive or if he has died in the intervening years. She does not know if the maps he showed her actually indicated disposal sites or if they were fabricated for psychological effect. What she does know is that her encounter was real, that Morris's statements suggested specific knowledge of disappearances, and that official investigation of those potential crimes remains insufficient and unsatisfactory. Alaska Paisley has concluded contains spaces where predators can operate with relative impunity, where investigation is inadequate, where missing persons remain unaccounted for, and where the mechanisms designed to protect travelers have fundamental failures that allow exploitation to continue unchecked. Some roads, once they have been marked on the maps of those who hunt, continue to be traveled by new victims who do not know the danger they face.